At my father's wedding, his new stepdaughter slapped me so hard the sound echoed across the ballroom. My glass shattered on the floor, champagne soaking my dress, and before I could breathe, she leaned close and hissed, "You don't belong in this family." Guests gasped, some even laughed, while my father sat frozen at the head table, lips pressed shut as if pretending nothing had happened. Her handprint burned across my cheek, a red mark glowing under the chandelier, and humiliation wrapped around me tighter than the silk of my ruined gown. Rafaela smirked, tossing her hair back like a queen who had just crushed a rival. She had no idea who I really was. She thought I was just a nuisance to be swatted away, a stranger daring to stand too close to her mother's new life. But within the hour, the officiant would announce the truth. I was her stepsister. And the slap she had just delivered wasn't only an assault witnessed by everyone in that hall, it was the beginning of her downfall. Phones were already raised, recording the moment. The violinist had stopped mid-song, and the silence pressed down heavier than the sting in my jaw. My father's new wife, Linda, didn't flinch. In fact, I caught the faintest smile curve her lips, as if her daughter had done what she secretly wished she could. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, waiting to see if I would cry, run, or crumble. But instead, I lifted my chin. I refused to break. What Rafaela didn't know was that this wasn't just about one slap. This was about years of being silenced, dismissed, and gaslit by the people who should have protected me. Tonight, she thought she humiliated me. In truth, she gave me the evidence, the witnesses, and the fire I needed to finally fight back. I should have known this wedding would never feel like a celebration. My father, Richard Carter, was standing at the altar just 2 hours earlier, beaming beside his new bride, Linda, a woman I barely knew, but who had already made it clear that she didn't want me around. She was polished, elegant, always whispering in my father's ear, and her daughter, Rafaela, shadowed her every move. To everyone else, they looked like a perfect pair entering a bright new life. But to me, they were a reminder that my mother's memory had been buried under designer gowns and expensive wine. My mother had died when I was 22, and my father wasted no time rebuilding his world without her. In his eyes, Linda filled the space neatly, and I was supposed to smile and nod, grateful for scraps of attention. When the invitation came, I debated whether to attend at all. Still, I told myself showing up was the respectful thing, the decent thing. I pressed my best dress, packed a suitcase, and drove the 3 hours to the resort hotel, rehearsing polite words and fake smiles. From the moment I arrived, I felt like an intruder. Rafaela was everywhere, her laughter too loud, her presence overwhelming. She was only 22, but carried herself like she owned the world. She flitted around in a silver gown, pulling at waiters, snapping at bridesmaids, and rolling her eyes at anyone who dared not worship her. When she first saw me step into the hall, her smirk told me all I needed to know: I wasn't welcome. She glanced me up and down and whispered something to her friends, and they all laughed. I had seen this act before. Rafaela was the kind of girl who collected cruelty like trophies. I tried to ignore her. I stayed near the buffet, chatted quietly with an old colleague of my father's, and kept my head down, but Rafaela made it her mission to notice me. She brushed past me with her elbow, hard enough to spill my drink, then feigned surprise. She accidentally dropped a plate of hors d'oeuvres inches from my shoes, giggling as a bridesmaid filmed it. At one point, she leaned close enough for only me to hear, and murmured, "Dad already replaced your mom. He'll replace you too." The words sliced deeper than the sting on my cheek hours later. I felt the ground tilt beneath me the same way it had when my father first told me he was engaged. I told myself to breathe, to let it slide. That's what my father always said. "Don't take things so seriously, Emily. She doesn't mean it. She's young." But I wasn't imagining the malice in her eyes. Linda only reinforced it, drifting past me with her hand lightly on my father's arm, whispering with a smile, "Emily looks uncomfortable. She really needs to learn to relax." Gaslighting wrapped around me like smoke, suffocating, making me question whether I was the problem. Still, I stayed quiet. I had promised myself I wouldn't ruin this day, no matter how humiliating it felt. I thought if I could make it to the cake cutting, slip out early, drive home, and bury myself in lesson plans and stacks of ungraded papers, I would survive. But survival wasn't what they wanted. Rafaela wanted spectacle. She wanted me destroyed in front of everyone. And Linda, with her polite smile and calculating eyes, wanted my father to believe that I didn't belong, that his new family was all he needed. The ballroom sparkled, chandeliers glittered, and laughter rose in waves around me, but I felt like I was standing in enemy territory. Each giggle from Rafaela's circle was a dagger, each dismissive glance from Linda, a nail in the coffin of the family I once knew. By the time Rafaela stormed toward me with her hand raised, I realized I had been cornered from the very beginning. This wasn't a wedding for love. It was a performance, and I had been cast as the villain in their script. They just didn't know I had my own story to tell. Rafaela didn't waste any time turning her pettiness into a full show. The moment the band started playing soft jazz and waiters began passing trays of champagne, she circled me like a predator testing its prey. She brushed against my arm so sharply that my glass nearly spilled again, then laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. A group of her friends followed her around to their dresses glittering under the chandeliers, phones in their hands ready to record. I could feel their eyes on me waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to give them the meltdown they wanted. At first, it was small things, her heel conveniently grinding against the hem of my gown, her perfume clouding around me as she leaned in too close and whispered cruel lines. "Your father didn't even want you sitting near him at the table. You should just go home." Each comment was soft enough that no one else could hear, but her friends giggled like they were in on the joke. When I tried to step away, she blocked my path with her champagne flute and a perfectly arched brow. Then she escalated. During the toast, when the best man raised his glass, Rafaela suddenly stumbled so convincingly it could have been rehearsed, and her drink sloshed across my arm. Gasps rippled through the tables, but instead of apologizing, she burst out laughing. "Oops, guess you can't handle a little attention." Linda glanced over from the head table, but her lips only curved into a knowing smile, as if her daughter's cruelty was something to be proud of. My father kept his eyes fixed on his wine, swirling it slowly as though the pattern in the glass could erase me from existence. I clenched my jaw and forced a smile, brushing champagne from my sleeve. But inside my chest, the humiliation burned hotter than the alcohol soaking into my skin. I had been through years of quiet dismissal, years of gaslighting from both my father and anyone he allowed too close. But this was different. This was public. Rafaela knew it too. The glint in her eyes told me she was thriving on the attention. She sauntered back to her friends who giggled louder than before, their phones tilted just enough to capture me in the background, drenched and embarrassed. One of them muttered, "She looks pathetic loud enough for me to hear." When the first dance ended and guests moved back to their tables, I thought maybe it was over. But Rafaela wasn't finished. She strutted straight toward me, holding a plate piled high with appetizers. Without warning, she tilted it just enough for a smear of cheese to land across my dress. The crowd closest to us gasped again, a mixture of shock and awkward laughter, and Rafaela covered her mouth in mock horror. "Oh no, I'm so clumsy," she cooed, but her grin betrayed her. Something in me snapped. Not enough to strike back, not yet, but enough to lock my spine in place and meet her eyes with steel. She blinked, caught off guard before sneering and leaning close. "Dad already replaced your mom. Soon he'll forget you too." Those words were a knife twisting in the oldest wound I carried. My breath hitched, my eyes burned, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of tears. I wanted to scream, to shout, to expose her cruelty for what it was. Instead, I stayed silent, my chin raised. But the silence only fueled her. She turned, raised her voice, and called out, "Why is she even here? She doesn't belong at our table. She doesn't belong in our family." Guests turned confused whispers rising again. I felt dozens of eyes on me, some sympathetic, others curious, a few judgmental. My heart pounded, my palms ached from the fists I had made at my sides. This wasn't just bullying anymore, it was a performance, a spectacle. She wanted the whole room to see me as weak, unworthy, disposable. The humiliation was unbearable, but I reminded myself, hold on. Don't give her the breakdown she wants. But deep down, I knew this was building towards something worse. Rafaela wasn't going to stop until she left a mark, until she had proof she had crushed me completely. And when she raised her hand later that night when the slap cracked across my face and silence drowned the room, I understood that every cruel laugh, every whisper, every spill had been rehearsals for that single moment of violence. It happened faster than I could brace myself. Rafaela's footsteps clicked across the marble floor as she strode toward me, her silver gown shimmering under the chandeliers, her hand curled into a fist that suddenly opened into a flat palm. Before I could even move, her arm swung through the air, and the sound of her slap cracked like thunder, slicing through music and chatter alike. My head snapped to the side, my hair flying across my face. A burning sting bloomed instantly across my cheek, and the entire ballroom went silent. Guests froze with forks halfway to their mouths, glasses tilted mid-toast, eyes wide with disbelief. Then came the whispers, a ripple of gasps and murmurs. I staggered backward, nearly toppling into the buffet table, my glass tumbling from my grip and shattering into 100 jagged pieces across the tile. Champagne splashed up the hem of my dress, soaking the delicate fabric, but the pain in my face drowned out everything else. My heart pounded in my ears, my vision blurred, but the humiliation was sharp and merciless. Rafaela stood tall, chest heaving, her lips twisted into a cruel smirk. "You don't belong here!" She spat, her voice dripping with venom. Laughter flickered from one corner of the hall, her friends' phones raised, recording gleefully. I searched the room for help. My father sat stiffly at the head table, glass still in his hand, his face pale but his mouth sealed shut. He didn't rise, didn't speak, didn't even look at me directly. Beside him, Linda leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on me with the faintest trace of satisfaction pulling at her lips. Her daughter had just struck me, and she wasn't horrified, she was pleased. The sting deepened into a throb, heat radiating down my jaw, but the shame was worse. Dozens of eyes burned into me, some sympathetic, others entertained, most simply frozen. My skin crawled under their scrutiny. I could hear a bridesmaid whisper, "Did you get that as a phone camera zoomed in?" Another muttered, "She deserved it, though she didn't even know me." I wanted the ground to split open beneath me to swallow me whole and free me from their judgment. But instead of retreating, I forced myself to stand straighter. I lifted my chin, even as tears threatened to spill, refusing to give Rafaela the collapse she wanted. The silence stretched heavy, broken only by the faint hiss of the champagne fizzing on the floor. My cheek pulsed, red proof of the violence no one could deny. Rafaela tossed her hair triumphant and turned to the crowd as though expecting applause. For her, this wasn't just a slap, it was a performance, a crowning act in a play where I was the unworthy intruder. She thought she had established dominance, had erased me with one strike. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know that in minutes the officiant would announce me as part of this new family, that I was her stepsister, not some nameless guest to humiliate. She didn't know that every second of her violence was being captured on camera evidence that would follow her long after the music resumed and the night ended. She didn't know that what she thought was power was actually her undoing. I touched my cheek lightly, feeling the heat radiate beneath my fingertips, and in that pain I found clarity. This wasn't just about one slap. It was about years of being silenced, dismissed, told I was imagining things. It was about my father choosing comfort over truth, about Linda whispering poison until it dripped into every corner of my life. And it was about me deciding right then that I would no longer be their scapegoat. Rafaela's handprint burned across my skin like a warning, but I chose to see it as a spark. Around me, guests murmured, some shaking their heads, some looking away. The band stood awkwardly near their instruments, waiting for a cue that never came. The air was thick with tension, and in the middle of it all I stood, cheeks aflame, heart hammering, and knew with cold certainty that this night was only beginning. The officiant's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. He had returned to the stage, shuffling his notes nervously, clearly unsettled by the chaos, but determined to keep the evening moving. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with the cake, I'd like to formally acknowledge the bride's daughter, Rafaela, and welcome the groom's daughter, Emily Carter, who today officially become stepsisters." The words landed harder than the slap itself. Gasps rippled across the hall. A murmur surged from table to table, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Heads turned toward me, then back to Rafaela, as though the crowd had suddenly realized the performance they'd just witnessed was not a spat between strangers, but an act of violence between new family. Rafaela froze mid-smirk. Her face blanched, the confidence draining away like color bleeding from a painting. She blinked, looked around, then back at me, her lips parting, but no words coming. For the first time that night, she looked rattled. Her mother, Linda, stiffened in her chair. She raised her glass as though to mask her expression, but I saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes, a sharp calculation working behind her smile. She had known, of course, but she hadn't expected the officiant to say it so bluntly, so publicly, turning Rafaela's cruelty into a humiliation no amount of denial could wash away. My father shifted, finally adjusting his tie, but still he said nothing. His silence was its own betrayal, a choice to protect his fragile new family over acknowledging the daughter who had just been assaulted in front of him. The room crackled with discomfort. Some guests looked at me with sudden sympathy, others at Rafaela with open judgment. A few whispered harshly. She slapped her own stepsister. The phones that had been recording now captured not just the slap, but the reveal proof of who we really were to each other. I stood rooted to the spot, my cheeks still throbbing, but inside me something shifted. For years, I had carried the weight of my father's choices, the dismissals, the gaslighting that made me doubt my own reality. Tonight, in one sentence, the curtain had been ripped away. Everyone could see the truth. I wasn't some outsider crashing a wedding. I was blood of the groom family by law, and the victim of a violent display that Linda had allowed, that Richard had ignored, and that Rafaela had delivered with pride. The officiant stumbled through his next line, trying to salvage dignity, but the damage was done. Rafaela's hands shook her champagne glass, trembling, the smirk long gone. Guests were no longer amused. They were appalled. A man at the next table muttered, "She could be arrested for that," loud enough for several others to hear. I lifted my head higher, meeting Rafaela's eyes. She looked at me as though she wished she could erase the last 5 minutes, as though if she stared hard enough I might vanish. But I didn't. I held her gaze, silent and unflinching. The power had shifted. Not because my father spoke for me, not because Linda apologized, but because the truth had been spoken aloud for everyone to hear. In a single announcement, Rafaela's attempt to cast me as an intruder collapsed. She hadn't just humiliated me, she had humiliated herself, her mother, and my father's fragile new marriage. And as the whispers grew louder, as eyes followed her with condemnation instead of admiration, I realized the slap was no longer just an act of cruelty. It was evidence. Evidence that would follow her long after the flowers wilted, long after the music stopped, and long after this wedding was remembered for everything but love. The tension in the ballroom was unbearable. Guests whispered louder now, not even bothering to hide their disgust. Phones hovered in the air, their small red dots blinking like judgmental eyes, recording every second. The slap, the reveal, the humiliation. Evidence was piling up with every tick of the clock. That was when the hotel's head of security appeared, flanked by 2 staff members in dark suits. They had been stationed discreetly near the entrance, but after hearing the commotion, they pushed their way through the crowd. The taller one, a stern man with a shaved head, approached me first. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His eyes darted to my cheek, still swollen and flushed red. I nodded stiffly, though my throat ached with the urge to speak. Before I could answer, Rafaela threw up her hands dramatically. "This is ridiculous! She provoked me. Everyone saw she was in my way. She was—" Her words tangled, shrill and desperate. A few guests shook their heads, unimpressed by the performance. The shorter security officer stepped between us. "Ma'am, please calm down." He gestured for her to back away, but Rafaela only scoffed and folded her arms across her glittering gown. "Do you know who my mother is?" "You can't talk to me like that." Linda finally rose from her chair, her smile tight, her tone syrupy. "Gentlemen, thank you for your concern, but this is just a family matter. Emotions run high at weddings. There's no need to escalate." But escalation was exactly what had already happened. A man from the next table, a guest in a navy suit, stood up and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I'm an attorney. I witnessed the entire assault, and I have it recorded on my phone." He lifted the device for all to see. Murmurs swelled again, louder this time, like waves breaking against rocks. Rafaela's face drained of color. The attorney continued, his voice carrying across the hall. "This isn't a joke. This young woman," he gestured toward me, "was struck in front of over 100 witnesses. That is assault, and I strongly advise she consider pressing charges." All eyes swung back to me. My father shifted uncomfortably, his knuckles wide around the stem of his wine glass. "Emily," he muttered at last, barely audible. "It's just one slap. Don't make a scene." My chest tightened. Even now, after everything he was asking me to shrink, to swallow my pain for the sake of appearances. I looked at him, at the man who once tucked me into bed and kissed my forehead goodnight, and felt the sharp sting of betrayal pierce deeper than Rafaela's hand ever could. But then I turned to the attorney, to the guests watching, to the security guards waiting for my answer. For the first time in years, I felt something stronger than shame rising in me, resolve. "No," I said, my voice steady though my hands shook. "I'm not going to ignore this. She assaulted me, and I want to file a report." The crowd buzzed like electricity. Rafaela's mouth dropped open, her confidence crumbling. Linda hissed, "Emily, think about what you're doing." But I was already thinking of every time they had gaslit me, every time my pain had been minimized, every moment my voice had been silenced. The taller guard nodded firmly. "Very well. We'll need to call the police." He tapped his radio, murmuring into it. Gasps and murmurs grew louder as word spread. Some guests began recording again, eager to capture what was about to unfold. Rafaela shrieked, "You can't arrest me! This is my mother's wedding!" The attorney shot back coldly. "No one is above the law, young lady. Not even you." Linda rushed to my father's side, clutching his arm. "Richard, do something! Stop this madness before it ruins everything!" But my father only sat there, paralyzed, his silence damning. A hand touched my shoulder gently. I turned to see a woman I didn't recognize, perhaps one of Linda's distant relatives, whisper, "Good for you, sweetheart. Don't let them walk over you." Her words steadied me. For the first time that night, I felt the crowd tilting in my favor. 10 minutes later, 2 uniformed police officers entered the hall, their radios crackling, their presence commanding instant silence. One of them approached me, asked my name, took my statement, while another pulled Rafaela aside. She raged, flailed, called me every name she could muster, but the officers remained calm, their pens scratching across notepads. When one finally produced handcuffs, the room erupted. Guests whispered, gasped, and craned their necks as Rafaela was restrained, her silver gown shimmering under the harsh grip of the law. "This is a wedding," Linda cried, her voice cracking. "You can't take her in front of everyone." But they could, and they did. As Rafaela was led out through the ballroom doors, her eyes wild, her face pale, I felt the first flicker of justice ignite in my chest. She had thought she could humiliate me without consequence. Now she was the one humiliated, her downfall recorded on dozens of phones destined to live online forever. And I knew as the doors shut behind her and the murmurs filled the silence she left behind that this was only the beginning. The police had taken Rafaela out of the ballroom, but the fallout clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Guests whispered at their tables, some disgusted, some entertained, most stunned that the perfect fairy tale wedding had just dissolved into chaos. I barely had time to collect my breath before a staff member tapped my arm and whispered that my father wanted to see me privately. I followed down a narrow hallway to a side lounge, my cheeks still burning, my gown stained with champagne and food. My father was there already, pacing by the window, his face pale. Linda sat on the sofa, her hands clasped in feigned worry, but her eyes glimmered with anger. She looked at me the way someone looks at an inconvenience they can't erase. "Emily," my father began, his voice low, urgent, "you need to let this go. It was just a slap. She's young. She didn't mean it. If you press charges this wedding, our family will never recover." Linda leaned forward, seizing the opening. "Your father is right, dear. Rafaela lost her temper. Yes, but surely you don't want to ruin your father's new marriage over a misunderstanding. Imagine the gossip if this becomes official. Do you want to be the reason your father's happiness is destroyed?" Their words circled me like chains, the same kind of chains I had carried since childhood. I remembered the nights my father dismissed my tears with "don't be dramatic," the days Linda gaslit me with subtle digs and backhanded smiles. They wanted me to shrink again, to fold into silence, to bear the humiliation so they could go on pretending their world was flawless. I stood there, my hands trembling at my sides, my throat dry. For a moment, I nearly gave in, nearly apologized just to make the tension evaporate. That was what they expected. But then I saw my reflection in the darkened window, the swelling cheek, the wine-stained dress, the haunted eyes of a woman who had swallowed too much for too long. And something hardened inside me. "No," I said firmly. The words startled even me, echoing louder than I intended. My father stopped pacing, blinking as though he'd never heard me speak that way before. Linda's lips parted her polished facade, cracking. I took a breath. This isn't just about a slap. This is about every time you told me to keep quiet, every time you let someone else's voice matter more than mine. She attacked me in front of everyone, and you both watched. You did nothing. I won't let it be erased. Not this time. Linda shot to her feet, her mask slipping. "Emily, think about what you're saying. You'll ruin us all. Rafaela could be scarred for life if this goes on her record." I met her glare with one of my own. She should have thought about that before she raised her hand. The silence stretched heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the air vent. My father rubbed his temples, groaning. "Please, Emily, please don't do this to me." The words sliced deep. Not "don't do this to her," not "don't do this to us." To him. As if my pursuit of justice was an attack against him personally. In that moment, the final thread snapped. I realized my father would never choose me. He would always choose comfort silence, the easier road paved by whoever flattered him most. I straightened my shoulders. "It's already done," I said quietly, but with steel in my voice. "The police have the report. The videos are everywhere. This isn't my shame anymore. It's hers. And if you can't stand beside me for the truth, then I'll stand alone." Linda hissed, eyes narrowed to slits, but I didn't flinch. My father sagged into the chair, his face crumpled, but I felt no pity. For the first time in my life, I felt free. By the time I returned to the ballroom, the wedding was in shambles. The band sat in silence, their instruments untouched. Half-eaten plates littered the tables. Guests huddled in clusters, whispering furiously, their eyes darting toward the doors where Rafaela had been dragged out in handcuffs. The carefully planned celebration had collapsed into a spectacle. No one was admiring the flowers anymore. No one cared about the tiered cake waiting in the corner. The only thing anyone wanted to talk about was the slap, the arrest, and the family feud that had spilled into public view. Linda swept back into the room with my father at her side, her face painted with a brittle smile. She lifted her hands, trying to command the crowd's attention. "Everyone, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling with forced charm. "Let's not allow one misunderstanding to ruin this beautiful evening." But the murmur of voices didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Someone at the back called out, "That wasn't a misunderstanding, it was assault." A ripple of agreement spread and Linda's smile faltered. Richard looked older than I had ever seen him. His shoulders sagged, his suit rumpled, his gaze cast downward. He tried to raise his glass for a toast, but his hand shook so violently that the champagne sloshed over the rim. The guests didn't even bother to lift theirs. They were no longer celebrating. They were watching a train wreck. A group of bridesmaids slipped out their heels, clicking fast across the floor. A few guests openly filmed as Linda hissed at the planner, her polished composure crumbling into sharp gestures and clenched teeth. Every second was being captured, every failure preserved. The image of the perfect bride had shattered beyond repair. I stood near the back, unnoticed for a moment, taking it all in. Part of me ached this was supposed to be my father's new beginning, but a larger part of me knew the truth. This wasn't my fault. Rafaela had chosen violence. Linda had chosen silence. My father had chosen cowardice. The collapse of this wedding belonged to them. The murmurs sharpened into judgment. "Can you believe she slapped her stepsister on the wedding night, no less? Poor Emily. If it were my kid, I'd be ashamed." The whispers swirled like smoke, thick and suffocating, until Linda snapped. She turned her eyes locking on me across the room, and for a moment I thought she might scream, but she didn't. She forced another smile, brittle as glass, and turned back to her guests. The cake cutting never happened. The bouquet toss was forgotten. Guests began filing out in uncomfortable silence, some patting my arm gently as they passed. One older woman leaned close and whispered, "Good for you, dear. Don't let them silence you. Her words gave me strength. Meanwhile, outside, the ballroom windows flashing blue lights painted the parking lot. The police car idled Rafaela inside her silver gown bunched around her wrists, cuffed tightly in steel. Phones caught it all guests pressing against the glass for a better view. Within hours, the video would be online, spreading faster than any wedding photo ever could. Linda tried to salvage the evening by coaxing the band to play again, but no one danced. The music only highlighted the emptiness of the dance floor, the hollowness of the smiles. Richard sat slumped at the head table, staring into his untouched drink. He didn't look at me once. As I walked toward the exit, the whispers followed me. Some sympathetic, some curious, a few judgmental. But none of them mattered. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing. The humiliation had been real, yes, but so was the justice that had begun. Outside, the night air was cool against my burning cheek. The sirens faded as the police car drove away, carrying Rafaela toward the consequences she had earned. And I knew then that no matter how Linda tried to spin it, no matter how my father begged for silence, the truth was out. The world had seen. The damage couldn't be undone. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's story. By morning, the videos had spread online, snatched from the phones of guests who couldn't resist uploading. Clips of Rafaela slapping me the officiant's announcement that we were stepsisters, and finally, the police leading her away in handcuffs were everywhere. Headlines spun out of control, bride's daughter arrested for assaulting stepsister at wedding reception. Strangers on the internet debated my pain as though it were a spectacle. But reality was harder than the comments scrolling across screens. I woke each morning with my cheek still sore, my phone buzzing with messages from sympathetic relatives and from colleagues shocked by what they had seen. Some friends urged me to drop the charges for peace. Others said this was my moment to stand up once and for all. Deep down, I knew the truth, there was no going back. Rafaela spent one night in custody before her mother posted bail, but the assault charge stuck. The local district attorney's office reached out. They had enough witnesses, enough video, and they wanted my testimony. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was a legal case. Linda reacted with fury. She left me voicemails filled with honeyed threats. "Emily, think about your future. Do you really want this on record? You'll regret it. Families solve things quietly." But I didn't delete the messages. I saved them, every word evidence of the pressure she tried to exert. My father called only once. His voice was weary, almost broken. "Sweetheart, you're making this worse than it needs to be. Rafaela is young. She'll learn. Let's not drag it through court." The old me might have bent under his plea. But after years of shrinking, something inside me had shifted. I answered calmly. "Dad, she attacked me in front of everyone. This isn't about one night. It's about all the nights you told me to stay quiet. I won't be silent anymore." His sigh was heavy before he hung up. I contacted Grace Miller, a sharp-eyed attorney recommended by a colleague. Grace listened without judgment, only taking notes as I described every detail. She watched the videos carefully, pausing, replaying, pointing out moments I hadn't noticed, the smirk on Linda's face, the way Rafaela's friends egged her on. "This isn't just assault," Grace said. "It's a pattern of harassment. And with the public nature of it, a restraining order is more than justified." Together, we filed the paperwork. Within a week, a judge signed the temporary order. Rafaela could not contact me, approach me, or appear within 100 yards. The weight on my chest lifted slightly. For once, the law was a shield, not a distant idea. Meanwhile, Linda doubled down. She paraded Richard in front of reporters, painting Rafaela as the victim of a misunderstanding. "Teenagers make mistakes," she said, with a practiced tear sliding down her cheek, though her daughter was 22. But her spin unraveled quickly. Journalists pointed out the number of witnesses, the clarity of the video, the sheer cruelty of the words captured on tape. Sympathy turned cold. Sponsors for Linda's charity work began pulling out. Invitations to galas vanished. Her polished reputation cracked. At home, I tried to focus on my students, on lesson plans, on the rhythm of grading essays. But even in the classroom, whispers followed. "Miss Carter, is it true you were on the news?" one teenager asked timidly. I smiled tightly, deflecting, but inside, I knew the story had outgrown me. It was no longer just my wound, it was a symbol proof of how toxic families hide behind appearances until the truth forces its way out. Every night I replayed the slap in my mind, not because I wanted to relive it, but because I needed to remember what it had awakened in me. A line had been crossed, and I had chosen to stand firm. For the first time in years, I wasn't the silent daughter. I was the woman demanding justice, and the world was finally listening. The courthouse smelled of polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to halls where lives are dismantled and rebuilt. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly together, the restraining order tucked in Grace Miller's briefcase beside her. Across the aisle, Rafaela sat with her lawyer, her silver hair pulled back, her lips pressed in a pout that looked more like defiance than remorse. Linda was in the gallery dressed in black, dabbing at her eyes as if she were the grieving victim of some tragedy. My father was beside her, shoulders slumped, avoiding my gaze. When the judge entered, the murmurs died down. He was stern, middle-aged, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. "We are here today to hear the case of State versus Rafaela Montrose charged with misdemeanor assault," he began. My heart thudded in my chest. The prosecution moved quickly. They played the video's first 5 separate angles from guests' phones stitched together into a seamless account of the night. The slap echoed through the courtroom speakers, making me flinch all over again. The officiant's voice followed, announcing me as Rafaela's stepsister. The gasp of the crowd, the recording of her sneering, "You don't belong here." Every humiliating second was laid bare. The jury watched in silence, their expressions tightening with each replay. Witnesses were called: the attorney who had stood up in the ballroom, 2 waitstaff who had seen everything, even the hotel's security officer who had stepped between us. Their testimonies were calm, consistent, undeniable. Rafaela's lawyer tried to suggest it had been provoked, that emotions had run high, that weddings are stressful. But the evidence was a wall he could not climb. When it was my turn, I stood and swore in. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I spoke. I described the escalating harassment, the spilled drinks, the whispered cruelties, and finally the slap. I told them how my father had sat silent, how Linda had smiled, how humiliation had burned through me hotter than the sting itself. Grace guided me gently, her questions precise, allowing me to tell the story in full. By the time I stepped down, the courtroom felt heavy with the weight of the truth. Then Rafaela was called. She slouched in the witness chair, her chin raised in defiance. She admitted to the slap, but insisted I had provoked her. She was mocking me. She said, her voice pitched high. She was in my way. She kept smirking. She made me lose control. The prosecutor's eyebrows lifted. "So, your defense is that you lost control in a room full of witnesses, that you assaulted someone because she was standing near you?" Rafaela faltered, her eyes darting toward her mother. Linda dabbed her eyes harder, mouthing silent encouragement. But the damage was done. The judge's gaze was icy when he delivered his verdict. "Miss Montrose, this court finds you guilty of misdemeanor assault. Considering the public nature of this offense and the clear evidence of your intent, the sentence is 12 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management therapy. Furthermore, the restraining order filed by Miss Carter is upheld." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rafaela's face drained of color, her smirk gone. Linda shot to her feet, outraged. "This is absurd! She's just a girl, she doesn't deserve this!" But the bailiff barked, "Order," and she sank back down, fuming. My father stared at the floor, his hands limp in his lap. The judge turned his gaze toward me. "Miss Carter, you showed remarkable composure in the face of cruelty. Justice has been served here, and I hope this allows you to move forward." I swallowed hard, nodding. My cheek tingled as if remembering every second of that night. But inside me something loosened, as though a knot had finally been untied. When court adjourned, reporters swarmed the steps outside. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward me. Grace stood firm, shielding me as much as she could, but her voice was clear. "This is what happens when people think family ties excuse abuse." My client stood up for herself, and the law stood with her. Linda stormed past, dragging Rafaela by the wrist, hissing at reporters. My father trailed behind them, his eyes flicking to me just once before looking away. That single glance carried all the weight of years of neglect. I felt no warmth, only the cold finality of understanding. He had chosen his silence. He had chosen them. I walked down the courthouse steps into the crisp autumn air, the crowd buzzing around me, but for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. Not as the unwanted daughter, not as the scapegoat, but as someone who refused to be erased. Winter settled over Ohio by the time the dust began to clear. Snow lined the sidewalks outside my apartment, muffling the city's noise into a hush. I found myself sitting by the window most evenings, tea steaming in my hands, watching the flakes drift down and wondering how much of my life I had spent silenced waiting for others to change. The trial had ended, the verdict was final, and Rafaela was now serving her probation and community service hours. Photographs circulated online her in a neon vest picking trash along the highway, shoulders her face hidden beneath oversized sunglasses. For once, her spectacle wasn't glamour, but consequence. Linda's pristine reputation cracked beyond repair. Donors withdrew from her charity events, whispers of arrogance and manipulation following her into every room she entered. Her polished smile no longer charmed her pleas for sympathy fell flat. In private circles, she was branded the woman who raised a monster. Though I knew the truth was more complicated. She hadn't just raised Rafaela, she had enabled her, fueled her, smiled as she struck. As for my father, Richard, he sank deeper into silence. He called once more just before Christmas, his voice thin. "Emily," he said, "I didn't mean for any of this. I never wanted it to go so far." I listened, waiting for an apology that never came. He didn't say he was sorry for not protecting me, for sitting frozen while his new stepdaughter assaulted me for choosing comfort over truth. He only lamented the fallout, the shame, the whispers. "Maybe in time we can move past this," he said. I breathed slowly, then answered, "Dad, I already have, but not with you." Then I hung up. It was harsh, but necessary. I realized then that the healing I needed would never come from his acceptance. It would come from boundaries, from building a life where my worth wasn't conditional on anyone's approval. So I poured my energy into teaching. My students noticed the fire in me that hadn't been there before. I stood taller, my voice firmer, my lessons laced with quiet conviction. When a shy girl in the back of the room whispered that someone was bullying her, I knelt beside her desk and told her what I wish someone had told me years ago. Your voice matters. Don't let them make you small. Grace. My attorney became more than just legal counsel. She became a friend. Over coffee one Saturday, she told me, "You're stronger than most of my clients, Emily. Do you realize that most people would have walked away, but you stood your ground?" I smiled for the first time in weeks, the words settling deep into my chest. Rafaela tried to reach out once through a mutual acquaintance. A note slipped into my mailbox, scribbled with shaky handwriting. I didn't know they'd take it this far. I didn't know it would ruin me. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and slid it into a drawer. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't acknowledged the harm. She only mourned her downfall. That wasn't remorse. That was self-pity, and it wasn't mine to fix. The healing wasn't linear. Some nights I woke from dreams of the ballroom, the slap echoing, the laughter ringing in my ears. But instead of shrinking, I wrote. Page after page in my journal, I poured out the pain, the anger, the clarity. I wrote until the words transformed from wounds into lessons. By spring, I stood outside my apartment, the sun warm on my face, and realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't waiting for my father to defend me, for Linda to accept me, for Rafaela to respect me. I had stopped waiting and started living. I took a trip alone to the coast, walking the shoreline at dawn, the waves lapping at my feet. I breathed in the salt air and felt the last threads of humiliation wash away with the tide. I wasn't the girl who cowered at a wedding. I was the woman who stood tall in a courtroom. And when people asked me what had happened, I didn't flinch. I told them the truth. Not for pity, but for power. My stepsister slapped me at my father's wedding, I said calmly. It was recorded she was charged, and I pressed forward. Because no one, family or not, has the right to put their hands on you. That was my message, one I wanted anyone listening to remember. Family is not an excuse for abuse. Silence is not the same as peace. Gaslighting is not love. And respect is not optional. For the audience who watched my story unfold, for the students who looked up to me, for the girl inside me who once believed she had to stay quiet, I left the same words etched into every choice I made after Stand Firm. Speak loud. Demand justice. even when the ones hurting you share your blood. I knew then that healing wasn't just surviving, it was reclaiming. And I had reclaimed my voice.